Applejack, Twilight, it's good to see you both this morning, said Dr. Rose. His voice held an automatic cheerfulness as he repeated the same greeting he had used the last time they met. He favored Twilight with a smile as he hurried out from behind his desk. And how are you feeling today? Twilight gazed around the expansive room, the memories of their previous meeting passing through her mind. Just fine, she answered flatly, her voice steady. She couldn't show any weaknesses. Not now. She had a job to do. Applejack coughed politely and took a step forward. The nurses told me she had a bit of a nightmare last night. They found her on the floor next to her bed this morning, but she didn't want to talk to them about it. She didn't hurt herself, though. Twilight glared at her in betrayal, but Applejack didn't notice. There was a moment's pause. And other than that, there's nothing out of the ordinary to report. Dr. Rose shifted his attention back to Twilight, who turned away from Applejack, hiding her expression of surprise. Is that true, Twilight? Did you have a bad dream last night? With his gray-flecked mane, kind eyes, and slight frown, he was the embodiment of paternal concern. A feeling of calming reassurance radiated out from him like heat from a fireplace. Instead of a doctor, Twilight felt like she were addressing a family member, friend, or beloved neighbor. Someone she could confide in. Someone she could trust. It was just an act, nothing more than feigned interest and artificial sympathy. Like the rest of the staff, she could tell that his concern for her well-being was insincere. A part of his job, nothing more. Still, as she stared into the deep blue eyes that rested behind his gold-rimmed spectacles, she could almost convince herself of his honesty. Their world was constructed upon lies. They can never be trusted. Her eyes flickered to Applejack. Well, maybe some of them can. But then, why did she tell him about my dreams, but not about what I said in the hallway? What is she playing at? Briefly, Twilight considered denying that she had even had any nightmares, but just as quickly rejected the idea. A blatant lie would only convince them that she was hiding something, and the last thing she needed was more attention. Inside, she laughed. I can't trust them, and they can't trust me. Her amusement vanished when she realized that both doctors were still looking at her. Yes, I had a bad dream. Dr. Rose nodded before gesturing towards the high-backed chairs from before. All right. I'd like to talk to you about that, Twilight, if you don't mind. But first, why don't we all take a seat and get comfortable? Twilight caught Applejack's eye, but her expression was unreadable. If Applejack wasn't going to talk about what she had said in the hallway, then she wasn't either. Applejack turned away from Twilight. Does that mean me too, Dr. Rose? He nodded again, making his way over to the padded chairs. Of course. Since you'll be handling Twilight's case personally from now on, I think it's best if you're present for these little sessions. Twilight fought down any lingering apprehension she felt as she settled into the chair. Applejack's going to be my doctor? She asked, her spirits lifting at the prospect, before her good cheer was squashed beneath a healthy dose of doubt and suspicion. A personal doctor? Why would they be giving her a personal doctor? What did that mean exactly? You've already been under Applejack's care for a while, but considering your current condition and the nature of your treatment, I thought it would be for the best if we took a more involved role in your therapy. What about my other patients? Asked Applejack, keeping her expression steady but unable to keep displeasure from leaking into her voice. We're already understaffed as it is. I can't push all my other patients off onto someone else when... Dr. Rose cut her off with a raised hoof, the kindly father figure transforming instantly into a stern patrician. Applejack, I know exactly what you're going to say, and I won't be relocating all of your other patients. However, your schedule will be modified so you'll have fewer duties and will have more of your time allocated to Twilight here. Her treatment requires observation to make sure everything is proceeding smoothly. Applejack opened her mouth to protest further, but Rose hardened his gaze. The decision is final, Applejack. I won't hear any disagreement over this. Applejack nodded stiffly, keeping her mouth clamped tight, The anger on her face was evident to Twilight, the stubborn farmer turned doctor, trying but failing to hide her disappointment at Rose's decision. Applejack was as surprised as I was. Is she not involved in whatever is really going on here? They could be trying to trick me. But Applejack isn't that good an actor, and she didn't tell the doctor everything. The edges of Twilight's mouth lifted slightly. I did get through to her. She's starting to doubt this world, I'm sure of it. There was a short stretch of silence as the three ponies made themselves comfortable, but Dr. Rose was quick to dispel it. Levitating a notebook and pen before him, he leveled a warm but serious look at the other unicorn. You said you were feeling okay, but what about physically? Yesterday you had a few rough patches. Does your head hurt? Is anything aching or sore? No, not really, Twilight answered honestly. My voice is still a little tender, but that's it. Otherwise I'm feeling fine. The sound of pen scratching across paper echoed her words. And how about your stomach? Have you been eating well? She chuckled dryly. I ate as best as I could, considering what they were serving in the cafeteria today, but I haven't had any stomach problems as such, no. Even before she had finished, the doctor's pen was moving again, the sound of his quick note-taking the only disturbance in the quiet gaps between her answers and the next question. When he finished, he lifted his eyes from the paper. Can you tell me about the dream you had? Adjusting how her legs were positioned as cover, Twilight tried to work out just how much she had to say to avoid suspicion, without giving away anything he could use against her. I woke up back home, in Canterlot. I don't remember everything, but I remember there being lots of shadows that attacked me, and then I woke up. She coughed softly when she noticed that Rose was still staring at her. I guess I got scared of the dark and, being alone. Twilight, please don't lie to me, Dr. Rose said quietly. Although his expression continued to radiate warm concern, there was a look of gentle reproach in his eyes. Twilight blushed despite herself. Lying about anything is not going to help you get better. If there is something you don't want to talk about, then just tell me so. Honesty is the best policy when it comes to your health. It didn't matter how he knew she was lying. If she continued to deny it, it would just make them doubt her more. Doing her best to make her embarrassment at being caught seem like morose for her actions. She hung her head in shame. I'm sorry. It was scary. My friends were there too, but they were wrong, broken, and they attacked me too. And I just don't want to talk about it now. During school plays, Twilight had always been a nervous wreck whenever on stage, despite having every line memorized perfectly. She was no actor, never able to get into the mindset of becoming the character. Still, she was quite proud of the slight tremble she put into her voice. The subsequent sniffle was that of a distraught mare holding back her tears. If they had seen her face, it would have been obvious how wooden her performance was. She wouldn't be going to Las Pegasus any time soon, but it was enough to convince Dr. Rose. There, it's okay, he said soothingly. It's just a dream, and you don't need to talk about it now. We can discuss it later when you're ready. Nodding, as if thankful for the small mercy, Twilight pretended to wipe her eye before glancing up. Rose gave her a reassuring smile, while Applejack stared at her, the tightness in her jaw making it clear she hadn't been convinced. Twilight glanced away, feeling the burn of Applejack's eyes on her muzzle, half expecting Applejack to give her up to the doctor. To Twilight's relief, the Earth Pony remained silent once again. She dared to let herself hope it was a sign that she really had reached her friend. I'd like to talk about something else now, if I may, Rose said, bringing her attention back around to the doctor. Feeling a bit more sure of herself, Twilight nodded, giving him a deliberately weak smile. She'd let him ask a few questions, and then it would be her turn. Since yesterday morning, have you seen or heard anything strange? Anything that shouldn't be there? Anything that didn't seem real? Her thoughts flashed back to her arguing with herself in the mirror, but she masked the thought with a forced laugh. I'm wrongfully trapped in a hospital for the insane. Everything I see or hear is strange and unreal. I mean, have you seen or heard anything that you wouldn't expect in a hospital? She rolled her eyes. Yeah, I saw a mummy yesterday at lunch being fed by a nurse, she snapped without thinking. To her surprise, the sarcasm went straight over his head. A mummy, you say? He asked as he began scratching away at his notes. And it was in the cafeteria? What? Applejack's cough interrupted Dr. Rose's next question. Dr. Rose, I believe that she's talking about Miss Scratch, the photophobic patient of Dr. Roy's. She flashed Twilight a reproachful look. She's the mare with the facial burns. She was quickly joined by Rose in giving Twilight a look of stern disapproval, making her feel like a fool that had been misbehaving. Normally, she would have been annoyed, but Applejack's words rang in her ears. She lowered her eyes to the floor, her ears flattening against her skull. I'm sorry, she apologized, not needing to fake any sincerity. I shouldn't have said that. I didn't mean to, and it won't happen again. When she finally glanced back up, both doctors' faces had softened. It's all right, Sugarplum. I know you didn't mean it, and you said you're sorry. Just try not to speak before thinking is all. You wouldn't want to hurt any pony's feelings. Rose nodded with her. Yes, as long as you learned your lesson, there's no reason to stay upset. He quickly rechecked his notes, scratching out one line before continuing. Let's see. Where was I? Oh, all right. How are your memories, Twilight? Do you still remember nothing of Broadhoof before yesterday? Yes, sir, she replied, still shaking off her disgust at having used a crippled pony as a joke. Nothing new there. I have memories of everything leading up to 2 nights ago, and then I woke up here. Nothing is blurry, nothing is missing, and there are no gaps. It's just a clean transition from one world to another. The sound of writing halted. Twilight winced, realizing that she had let slip. She braced herself for the follow-up question, but it never came. The writing resumed. Inside, Twilight berated herself. Don't tell them anything about what you suspect, you oaf! Keep talking about other worlds, and even Applejack will be happy to keep you locked up. She glanced at her friend, remembering how she had responded in the hallway. She knows something is wrong, but she's not ready to accept the truth just yet. I just have to be patient. The trio sat silently, while Rose took what felt like an excessive amount of notes. I want you to think back to your memories of your life before you woke up here. Think back a few years, and think about the major events in your life. Now, do you notice anything missing? Any gaps or hazy patches? No. Nothing. I remember everything before the hospital perfectly. Rose lifted an eyebrow. Really? Yes, she replied, a hint of challenge in her tone. So you remember all the details of your life? Birthdays, vacations, graduation? He checked his notes. Your brother's wedding? You remember all the details of those events perfectly. Twilight frowned at the stress he put on the last word. Yes. Well, within reason, I mean. I'm not some kind of savant. I can't tell you how many panes of glass there are in Canterlot Castle's main hall from memory, she said with a laugh. Rose didn't smile. Twilight cleared her throat. But, yeah, I remember them pretty well. Who was there, what happened, how long it was, what we ate. You know, the usual stuff. Why don't you tell me about your brother's 10th birthday party? Inside, Twilight tried to discern what Rose was up to, showing such a fascination with her personal memory. Maybe he already has a version of it I told him before, and now he just wants to compare the two. She glanced down at the notebook floating between them. Of course! He's trying to see if my story checks out. He wants to see if I'm lying so he can use it against me. She inhaled sharply. But then, what version of the story does he have? The real version or the crazy version? You do remember your brother's 10th birthday party, don't you? Of course I do, she snapped irritably. She took another breath. The logical choice was to tell them the real memory. The odds of making up a convincing memory that matched up with a hypothetical false account were astronomical. Taking some comfort from her rational decision, Twilight straightened up in her seat and adopted a pose of relaxed confidence. Her memories were real. It didn't bother her if the doctor's notes didn't match up with reality. It took a lot longer than she had anticipated to retell the day's events from memory, almost entirely due to Dr. Rose's constant interruptions. Every few seconds he would ask her to focus on certain inconsequential details: how many guests there were, the number of presents, when the party started, and the flavor of cake were all brought up by Rose. Twice he asked Twilight the same question at different times, trying to trip her up by seeing if her story changed. It was a police interrogation in comfy chairs. And by the end of it, she was exhausted. Exhausted but unbowed. She didn't need to worry about his transparent tactics because the details had remained the same. After all, she was just recalling it from memory. Once she was finished, Dr. Rose took another minute to read back over his notes. "Well, Twilight," he eventually said, "this memory of yours must be quite vivid, very detailed, very consistent." He glanced at her over the rim of his glasses. "And you didn't notice anything hazy about the celebration?" Twilight grinned. "Nope. Well, I don't remember everything, of course, but I remember all the essentials just perfectly." Rose lowered his gaze back to his notes, but Twilight's smile vanished. There had been something in his eyes, hidden behind his mask of professional detachment. Amusement? Satisfaction? Pride? Why would he feel any of that? "How can you possibly remember all that?" Applejack blurted out, her first words in almost half an hour. The sheepish expression on her face as she turned to look at Rose made it clear she was worried about overstepping her bounds, but the older doctor just stared back neutrally. Taking his silence as permission to continue, she returned her attention to Twilight. "What I meant to say, Twilight, is that memory is supposed to be from almost a decade ago. You were a little full at the time, too. So how can you remember just how many presents your brother got, and the flavor of the cake, and what time the party started?" Twilight frowned. "I just do. Why is that important?" "Do you remember the day before the party that well?" Applejack pressed. "Well, no. I remember getting my main cut and picking out a new dress with Mom, and..." Twilight gulped, struggling to remember more so she didn't lose any ground with her friend. And we had lunch downtown, but Her voice trailed away as she glanced over at Applejack. That's all I remember," she admitted. To her confusion, Applejack looked pleased at her revelation. "Well, no pony has a perfect memory." Not understanding, Twilight looked from one doctor to another, looking for clarification. But her questioning glances only made both physicians' knowing expressions grow. She was overlooking something obvious, and it was annoying her to no end. She glared at Applejack, feeling like the butt of some private joke between the two. "What do you mean exactly?" It was Dr. Rose who answered. What Applejack was questioning was the lucid and highly detailed nature of your memories, Twilight. After all, no pony has a perfect memory. Twilight blinked. "Oh, of course." "It's good that you don't recall it all perfectly, because real memories aren't perfect. Being able to recall everything in your past would be a sign of delusions or a deliberate attempt to lie," he continued. Twilight barely noticed Applejack's deep frown at his words, her annoyance fading away as she realized where he was going with his explanation. Life, like memories, are imperfect. Being able to recall so much is a testament to your own quite prodigious mind, Twilight. She blushed at the compliment. "Thanks. My teachers have always complimented me on my memory. I'm just naturally really great at remembering things." It took Twilight a moment to process how conceited her words sounded. Her blush deepened. That's not to say I'm special or better than any pony else," she stammered. "I'm not bragging. I still have to study hard to remember all of my studies, It's just that I have a better I could remember stuff fairly well, but in a way that suggests that I am totally not superior to anybody else. It was only when she paused to inhale that she realized both doctors were looking back at her in amusement. Twilight's cheeks could have ignited paper as she inspected a particularly interesting spot on the carpet. Well, at least I know they haven't cured my phobia of making others think I'm an egotistical braggart, she thought, as her embarrassment slowly drained away. Their amusement faded with her nervousness, and soon Dr. Rose had returned to his questions, each one as innocuous and pointless as the last. What is your earliest memory? Can you tell me about the first time you met Princess Celestia? What were you doing a week ago? Each attempt to ask her own question was politely rebuffed by Rose. Unlike her, he grew more excited with every boring question. Oh, he hit it well, but she could see it in his eyes, and it confused her. To him, everything she was saying was nothing but the products of delusion and insanity. Why did he care? However, over time she found it hard to sustain her interest in answering that question. At first she had considered the nefarious plots that might require knowledge of her past, but the more she thought about it, the less sense any of them made. They already knew what her history was supposed to be in their world. Rose's use of the picture the previous day had demonstrated that well enough. Her stories of her past were no more real to them than a daring-do novel. Not knowing why they were so interested was almost justification enough to simply stonewall them and not say anything, but she dismissed the thought as a fruitless act of protest. She had more to gain by playing along and showing herself to be logical, sane, and collected. The less she seemed like the mental patient they believed her to be, the easier it would become to prove herself and earn their trust. The only thing keeping her mind on topic was the knowledge that she had one powerful trump card in her repertoire. It would only work once, and then only when she had an honest onlooker like Applejack to witness it. She had to save it for a desperate moment, as a tool of last resort. If she could get answers by just being patient, then she wouldn't have to tip her hoof. No matter how banal and annoying the questions become, she thought, grinding her teeth together as Rose asked her about how regular she had been with her trips to the bathroom. With no rational option available, Twilight continued to answer each question as simply as she could, hoping to get through them all with enough time to get some answers of her own. Biting back on her impatience, Twilight let Rose continue speaking. Slowly, her morning meeting with the doctor dragged on. Have you noticed any connections between your memories and what you've noticed around the hospital? Familiar faces, perhaps? It was the first question in a while not related to her having to tell a story or describe embarrassing biological functions, which was more than enough to rouse her mind out of its distracted state. She bet back her instinct to automatically deny it. They already knew she did have connections. Her conversations with Applejack and Pinkie Pie had demonstrated she was familiar enough with them at some level. The more they suspect you, the harder it will be to escape. Twilight sighed. Yes, I have. There are ponies in the hospital that I know, although their lives are not the same as I remember. Like Applejack? Yeah, like Applejack, she said, glancing at the suddenly uncomfortable-looking mare. She turned back to Rose, eyeing the doctor. Why did you need to ask me that? It's already in your file on me. And Pinkie Pie as well? He asked, as he stared at her intently, not even acknowledging her own question. Yes, her too, she groaned as more of her optimism was worn away by the unrelenting series of pointless questions. He wasn't going to let her ask any herself. It was obvious he was content to have her waste her time telling stories about childhood birthday parties and trips to the museum. He licked his lips and leaned forward. Since you woke up yesterday, have you seen Spike? She froze, her back straightening bolt upright. Her mouth went dry. What? Have you seen the dragon Spike yesterday? He repeated himself, the sharper edge of his question betraying a desire his tone of professional calm couldn't hide. How do you know about Spike? She whispered. You used to talk about Spike. You said he was your pet dragon, given to you by Princess Celestia. He was hatched from an egg and was... He flipped back a dozen pages through his notes. Purple and green, walked on 2 legs, and was about the size of a young foal. He glanced up. "So, have you seen him since yesterday?" "No, I haven't seen him!" Twilight shouted as she leapt out of her seat. "What happened to him? Where is he? What have you done to him?" The young mare's face was contorted with concerned fury. A mother bear whose cub was missing. 1,000 terrible possibilities flashed through her mind, her fear and anger mixing together into a volatile cocktail that was primed to explode. She barely noticed Applejack leap to her hooves, the earth pony taking a few steps forward so she could impose herself between Twilight and the stallion she was staring daggers at, but he simply gestured for both of them to stay still. "Twilight, sit down," he commanded, his voice firm but scholarly. A truncheon wrapped in a sweet jacket. He continued to hold Applejack back with an upraised foreleg as he met Twilight's stare evenly. "Twilight, sit down." Narrowing her eyes, Twilight slowly complied. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice low as dangerous and as threatening as she could make it. It didn't matter that she was outnumbered, outsized, and out of her league. "If they hurt a single scale on his head, I'll... We didn't do anything to Spike, because Spike isn't real." The words brought Twilight's furious thoughts to a screeching halt. Her eyelids continued to tighten as she glared defiantly at them. "What do you mean, he isn't real? How would you know about Spike if he didn't exist? I swear, if you did anything to him—" "Spike is a delusion of yours," Dr. Rose said, keeping his voice smooth and patient. "I know about Spike because you've talked about him in the past." "That's not true," she growled, breathing rapidly. "Twilight, I've had a number of conversations with you over the years where you assured me that Spike was in the room with us. You've described him at great lengths to myself and others. In fact, many times you were dictating your own notes and letters to him." "Stop this," she hissed, her eyes darting around the room as she pulled back further into her chair. "Stop hurting me like this. Spike is real," she reminded herself, repeating the phrase constantly. A maelstrom of emotions surged around within her breast. Anger and loss and fear and doubt swirling together. Twilight sniffled as she fought back her tears, unwilling to give in. She wasn't going to surrender to her emotions like she had yesterday. Instead, she focused on her convictions. She focused on the truth. She focused on her mantra. Spike is real. Spike is real. Spike is real. We're not trying to hurt you, Twilight, but I need to confirm what you said, that you haven't seen Spike since you woke up. Is that true? Again, she caught a glimpse of the hunger within his voice, a subtle undercurrent to the normal tones of paternal calm. He was excited at the prospect of Spike being absent. It was a mystery as to why, but at the moment she wanted nothing more than to tell him he was wrong and that she had seen Spike, just to spite him. She glanced at Applejack, who was trying to look as non-threatening as possible, while still poised to leap to Rose's defense. That they would even seriously think that Twilight was any kind of threat to a stallion almost twice her mass was absurd. It would have been comical if she weren't struggling to keep herself calm. Her mind spoke calmly. Focus on her. Focus on Applejack. Her mind spoke calmly, but her thoughts were still loud enough to drown out the emotional cacophony clamoring for your attention. You need to convince Applejack you're not crazy. You can't risk reinforcing her beliefs in your supposed schizophrenia just because it's not what he wants to hear. That's not logical. You're better than that. Focus on Applejack. Focus on your friend. Despite the necessity, it was still difficult to actually admit that she hadn't seen him. It was the truth. But speaking it aloud would serve to reinforce the point that her Spike, the Spike she had raised from a hatchling, the Spike that slept by her side every night, the Spike that looked up to her as something between a big sister and a surrogated mother, wasn't there with her. She did her best to mollify herself, pointing out that at least he wasn't suffering like she was. It didn't help. Yes, I haven't seen Spike since I woke up, Twilight said grudgingly, the words tasting sour as she spat them out. Her mood only darkened when Rose gave her a broad smile of victory. Unable to hide his excitement any longer. Oh, how she wished she didn't have her horns sheathed right then. Just one spell, that's all she needed. That is excellent news! Truly, truly excellent, he declared, with the exuberance of a stallion half his age. The mask of professional calm had been discarded. His honest emotions were bared. A broad, exulting grin, full of youthful excitement. He turned his smile on Applejack. What did I tell you? The treatment is working perfectly! We've eliminated a major visual and auditory hallucination. Applejack's response was much more subdued. Well, it seems so, but it's only been 1 day, Dr. Rose, she said. She softened the dose of reality with a gentle smile. Isn't it a little early to be celebrating? Yes, you are absolutely right, Applejack, he admitted, his placid doctor persona quickly returning to the fore as he let his elation fade. Still, he couldn't keep from giving Applejack a cheeky smirk. But it is pretty exciting. If her condition doesn't regress, then what we've done so far is poised to revolutionize the whole field, and without surgery. Twilight's eyes narrowed. I'm sorry, but what are you two talking about? She snapped, leveling her best angry schoolteacher glare at them. Applejack looked momentarily startled, but to Twilight's disappointment, Rose recovered smoothly, giving her a reassuring grin as he slipped back into his wise doctor role. We're talking about your treatment, Twilight, and how pleased we are with the results. With his calm tone and guiltless smile, he was an avatar of benign warmth. It was so easy to believe that he had her best interests at heart. She ran through a half-dozen spells off the top of her head that would fix his smirk. So why don't you tell me about my treatment instead of acting like I'm not even here? Rose was as stoic as ever, completely impervious to her bitter accusations. Still, she could take some satisfaction in the hurt look on Applejack's face. She could feel guilty about it later. This is the start of my 2nd day. I deserve some straightforward answers. That sounds pretty reasonable to... Dr. Rose silenced Applejack's apologetic voice with a stern glance. He turned away from the confused mare to address Twilight directly. You do deserve to know more about your treatment, he said, picking his words with care. However, I can tell that you're upset right now, and no matter how angry you are, you need to understand that I can't tell you everything. Why not? I deserve to know what you're doing to my body. That's a basic right for all equestrians, and has been since the revised Health and Safety Act was passed 215 years ago. His perplexed expression was a proud monument to her victory, but it was only the first battle. Rose was on the back hoof of reeling, caught off guard by her opening salvo and struggling to respond. It was time to use her most powerful weapon, her extensive knowledge of equestrian law and landmark legal cases. It states that any physician has to fully explain a treatment or operation to a patient to their satisfaction if requested. It also states that no patient can be forced to undergo a treatment or operation against their explicit consent. Her lips twisted into a predatory smirk as she closed in for the kill. And right now, with Applejack as my witness, I am telling you that I am exercising my right as an equestrian citizen to refuse any further treatment until you explain everything to my complete and utter satisfaction. Both Twilight and Rose stared back at Twilight, their discomfort only fueling the silence. She had him right where she wanted him. This time, she wasn't alone with a nurse threatening to force-feed her pills if she refused to take him. This time, she had a witness. Applejack might not have been the same mare from her world, but she had seen her doubt out in the hallway. If Rose refused to answer her, if Rose blatantly denied her rights, then Applejack would see it for herself. She wouldn't be able to deny that things didn't add up any longer, not after a display like that. That left him with one practical, logical, and realistic option. Tell her everything. I can't lose, she thought, as she gave the stallion her most cocksure grin. After answering so many of his inane questions, she was eager to get some answers of her own. After 2 days of being told where to go and what to do, she was making things happen how she wanted them to go. She was being proactive, and she was going to savor every moment of it she could. I think I earned the right to gloat just a little bit. Removing his glasses, Dr. Rose set about cleaning them by hoof, wiping away non-existent grime with the corner of his lab coat. It was a transparent delay tactic, but Twilight contented herself with an exaggerated eye roll instead of interrupting him. After all, the sooner he was ready to speak, the sooner she would get her answers. Once he was satisfied that the imaginary dirt was gone, he finally met Twilight's gaze. Well, I can see you've been putting your personal library to good use, Dr. Rose said with an uncomfortable chuckle. Although, I wish you hadn't brought this up, Twilight, because you're forgetting 2 important details. She lifted an eyebrow. Oh, what am I forgetting then? You're not an adult, Twilight. You're a filly. The false humor was gone. In its place, the stallion's voice was flat and austere. An intelligent and precautious filly, certainly, but you're still not a full-grown mare, and a child's treatment is determined by their parents or legal guardians. Rose levitated over the thick manila folder she knew contained all of her paperwork, and, after a quick search, produced a few sheets of paper. She shivered reflexively as he floated them over to her. But he wasn't tormenting her with any more photographs. Instead, it was a standard black and white medical form. The dry legal text said very little, only explaining that the signatories were giving their consent for their child to be treated as discussed during previous consultations. She reread it 3 times just to make sure, ignoring the wrenching sensation in her gut at the sight of her parents' familiar signatures at the bottom. Well, then why don't you go and get my parents here so we can discuss this again? I am willing to bet you won't have their consent after I get through telling them about this place. But until I speak to my parents, I'm not going to let any of you lay a hoof on me, Twilight promised, as she thrust the papers back over to the doctor. And this doesn't explain anything about what my treatment actually is. Dr. Rose frowned, a hint of his growing irritation breaking through his stoic demeanor. He opened his mouth, but it was Applejack who spoke first, her tone gentle and conciliatory. Now, Sugar Cube, that's just not going to work, and you know it. We still have medical needs, and we can't halt your medication for a week while we wait for your parents to show up, just so they can confirm that yes, they still want you to be treated. It just doesn't work that way. It's unfair to them, to us, and to yourself. Twilight eyed Applejack distrustfully. So you're going to keep me locked up, deny me access to my family, and force me to undergo some unexplained treatment against my will? Not at all, Twi. If we have the time, we'll explain it to you. If not, then I'll explain it all later tonight. Afterwards, if you still want to, we can even write those letters to your parents, she offered. Or, if you don't want to wait for tonight, you can still have your caseworker help you write the letters as soon as we're done here. Twilight blinked. Caseworker? You mean somebody from a government agency? Somebody who doesn't work for the hospital? Exactly. She's here for just these sorts of situations. After all, your parents can't be here all the time to keep an eye on you, and you're too young to make informed medical decisions on your lonesome. Applejack smiled sheepishly as Twilight gave her an annoyed glare. What I meant is, you can't make them legally, Pumpkin. I know you're one smart cookie, but still, the law's the law. So everything I say to her is confidential? She doesn't answer to any of you? No, they are completely independent, Rose answered, with the same false smile every doctor seemed to wear when explaining things to her. She imagined it was supposed to be reassuring, but she couldn't see it as anything other than the same smile a teacher gave the eager but slow kid in class whenever they asked a question that had just been answered. Like Applejack said, they're here to act as a third party on behalf of your parents. As a foal, you need an adult looking out for you, and they're the intermediary between your parents and the hospital. His smile fell away like a house of cards under a stiff breeze, replaced with a look of mild reproach.
Now, that doesn't mean you get to simply ignore what your doctors say because you want to wait for your parents to tell you in person that they agree with your treatment program. If it will make you feel better, you can certainly talk to your caseworker about your concerns and write a letter for her to mail for you. But you cannot refuse the very treatment your parents agreed upon. Do you understand, Twilight?
She wanted to tell the older pony off, her instinct to rebel against her oppressors burning strongly within her very core. Her logical mind wouldn't allow it. Instead of throwing a fit, she simply nodded. "Yes, I understand perfectly," she replied, as she settled back into her seat, her confidence floating atop a new wave of optimism. "This caseworker is perfect! I can get her to carry a letter to my parents, letting them know about my situation. Even if they think I'm supposed to be crazy, too, it should be much easier to convince my parents that I don't belong here, or the hospital is mistreating me, or something just isn't right. All I need to do is make them doubt for a second, and presto, I'm free. And once I'm free, I'll be able to work on getting home and fixing this whole thing."
If that is all settled, then can we return to the questions? Rose made a show of glancing at his watch before reaching for his notepad. The longer we take, the less time you have with your caseworker.
"Not yet," Twilight stated, trying to keep as much strength in her voice as she could. "I've been answering all your questions, but before we go on, I want to know something about my treatment. After 2 days, I still haven't had anyone explain to me anything about how it works, or what it actually entails. It is still my right as a patient to know what you're doing to me. So please, can you tell me what my treatment actually is?"
Well, it's all very technical.
"I'm a smart mare, Rose. Just try me."
Dr. Rose adjusted his glasses. It's a new, although not untested, method of care composed of medication and magical healing that is focused upon fixing the underlying core problems inherent within mental disorders. With a targeted medication regime to control symptoms, we can use both magical and physical methods to try and correct larger issues with the goal of giving our patients a more regular and balanced life without having to resort to invasive surgery. Our goal at Broadhoof has always been to focus on giving our patients the means to thrive beyond our walls and live as normal a life as possible. And hopefully my new system will allow previously unreleased patients to enjoy a life within wider equestrian society. There was a long pause after Rose finished, while the two mares just stared at him. Twilight was the first to speak.
"That sounded like a sales pitch," she frowned, but she continued. "You said a lot, but you didn't tell me anything. I wanted details, not something you tell investors."
Twilight, I am not going to spend the next few hours giving you a medical dissertation that is far above your head, just because you don't trust what your parents and the medical experts are telling you," he said curtly. "I've told you everything you need to know. Now, if we can, let's return to the questions so we can make sure you meet your caseworker on time, okay?"
"Fine," she sighed in defeat, gesturing for him to continue. He returned to his notepad while she examined her hoof. Twilight tried not to sulk, keeping a tight grip on her disappointment at being stonewalled so effectively by the older stallion. "He can just keep telling me nothing and pretending like he's answering my questions. I bet he's just hoping I'll forget everything anyway." She blinked as the word "forget" echoed in her mind, lifting her head to stare at Dr. Rose. "Wait, what's the second thing I'm forgetting?"
"What?" he asked distractedly, not looking up from his notes as he jotted down a few things. After a few seconds of silence, he finally looked over at her.
"I said, what's the second thing I am forgetting?" she repeated. "You mentioned 2 things. One is my age. What is the other?"
"Oh, it's nothing," he said dismissively. "No need to bring it up, now that everyone is back to the matter at Hoof."
"But I would like to know what it is regardless."
"It's not important," said Rose, putting a little more emphasis behind his words.
"Doctor, please, just tell me," she pleaded. "Every pony here has kept telling me how it would be for the best if I were to trust you. But how can I trust you if you're going to hide what you were just going to say?" She knew she was laying it on a bit thick, but she was vindicated when Rose let out a sigh of defeat.
His reluctance was evident in the slight downturn of his lips, and his clear hesitation before he began. What I was going to say was that, in your particular case, you couldn't reject treatment even if you were an adult. Something in his tone sent a shiver down Twilight's spine.
What do you mean? Of course I could. You couldn't keep me at the hospital against my will. That would be illegal, she argued.
Twilight, not all of our patients are here voluntarily, he said with care, as he glanced at Applejack. Her eyes widened in unspoken understanding before she turned to watch Twilight with a look somewhere between regret and pity. Twilight felt on edge as she glanced back at Rose. So ponies aren't allowed to leave just because they want to. It's not illegal. Far from it. They're here for a reason. In fact, it would be illegal to let them leave, because they're a danger to themselves and others.
Well, sure. I mean, you're not going to let some violent criminal psychopath leave just because he wanted to. Can you imagine an arsonist being let out just because he asked nicely? She laughed at the mental image. But I don't see how that applies to...
Twilight faltered when she realized she was the only one laughing. Both doctors were giving her odd looks. Their eyes were filled with reluctant expectation, like they were waiting for something they didn't want to happen.
My situation,
she finished lamely as she glanced from one doctor to another. The last few seconds replayed themselves in her mind. Twilight blinked.
No.
Applejack took a step forward, her eyes flitting around her face as if searching for something.
Now, Twilight. No!
Twilight repeated, shaking her head.
No! No, no, no! Twilight! I said no!
She snapped, glaring at both of them.
You are not going to tell me that now I'm supposed to be a violent criminal as well as being crazy. So, no. Just no. I don't care what you're going to say. My only response is no.
Twilight, you were only a fool at the time, Rose began, but she cut him off.
And evidently I'm still just a fool. And the idea that I, as a fool, somehow did anything bad enough to warrant not being able to legally leave this place is ludicrous.
Twilight took a deep breath, as if to continue, ready to give voice to the jumble of protests in her head, all shouting about how insane the very notion was. Instead, she let the air back out in a long, irritated hiss. She slumped down in her seat.
Sweet Celestia, it's not enough that everybody thinks I'm insane. Oh, no, now I'm insane and dangerous, she muttered,
rubbing her temple with a hoof. She felt a headache coming on. Applejack looked to Rose for permission before moving over to Twilight's side.
Twilight, I know that this is a bit of a shock, what with your memory loss and all. If you don't want to talk about it, I understand. No, I do want to talk about it, she said as she straightened back up. But not now. We, she gestured between herself and Applejack, are going to talk about this later. But all I want to do right now is finish up with the questions so I can go talk to this caseworker and send a letter to my family. The sooner that happens, the better. Crossing her arms, she stared at Rose. All right, Dr. Rose, let's get this over with. Ask away. The two physicians shared another look, but Twilight didn't care. It was petulant. She surely wasn't doing herself any favors acting like a stubborn fool. But ignoring that she was now some kind of dangerously insane pony was the only logical choice. The alternative was to just let out her frustrations and scream. That was hardly the best way to prove her case to Applejack. It doesn't matter. I'll get her to tell me whatever nonsense they're going to claim about me later, she told herself. My new priority is to send that letter. With my parents on my side, I can demand all the answers I need, and I'll have witnesses in case they attempt to lie to me some more. Rose is already doing his best to avoid telling me anything about his supposed treatment, and the longer they are allowed to medicate me against my will, the less a chance I'll have of breaking free from this place. She turned her attention to Applejack as Dr. Rose rearranged his notes, trying to pick up from where he had left off. The former farm pony seemed a bit taken aback by the whole episode, although, unlike Rose, she seemed more confused and uncertain. I need to remain focused on convincing Applejack that what they are saying about me is nonsense. If she believes that I'm a schizophrenic psychopath, then the more I show her that I'm a regular pony, the more she'll question what she is being told.
Twilight knew that getting Applejack to believe that she wasn't from this world, or that reality itself had been changed, would be a challenge.
But convincing her that I don't have any of the mental illnesses they claim, that's doable. That is a reasonable, logical, and practical goal. And that is the start of my liberation from this green and white prison.
All right then, Twilight. I just have a few more questions about Spike. Is it okay if we talk about him? Rose asked, his voice calm and conciliatory.
Yes, of course, she replied, doing her best to hold back her own emotions as well. She would show Applejack that she was a rational and intelligent pony, and not the nutcase the paperwork said she was. The more she showed herself to be reasonable, calm, and coherent, the more traction she would gain fighting the uphill battle against the twisted reality she was trapped within. She could do this. She was in control. She didn't even blink when Rose resumed his questions.
So, do you remember the last time you did happen to see Spike?
How are you holding up, Sugar Cube? Twilight turned her head, unsurprised to see Applejack giving her a concerned look. I'm fine, she replied, biting back her desire to snap at her friend. That was an ordeal, but at least it's over now. I hope nothing that we talked about in there upset you much, said Applejack, as she guided Twilight away from Dr. Rose's office. I mean, Spike normally is a bit of a sore spot with you, but I was just caught off guard by the question, she countered. If the treatment is supposed to have left me without any memories of my life in this hospital, being surprised by a question about a close friend and being told they aren't real is certainly going to get any pony riled up. She gave her friend a grim smile. Just put yourself in my shoes. What if you woke up tomorrow and were told that you had never left the farm, never became a doctor, and you had been bugging apples all your life? Applejack gave Twilight a weak grin. Sometimes I think I'd be a happier mare if I were still working on the farm. She halted and lifted a pulsating hoof at Twilight's gaze. Oh, I don't know what you mean, darling. You're dealing with this situation I wouldn't wish upon any pony. Reaching out, she patted Twilight's shoulder. And for what it's worth, I think you're holding up real well. I know you have your concerns about your treatment and all, but I can tell you that you've made some real progress already. If you'll just give it time, I know you'll be pleased with the results. The two resumed walking in silence, as Twilight mulled over how to respond. They passed down another hallway before she finally spoke. Applejack, about what I told you before we met Dr. Rose? Twilight, Applejack growled in warning. It was Twilight's turn to hold up a warding hoof. I'm not going to ask you to take off the magical silencer, so please just hear me out. She waited for Applejack to nod before continuing. Look, I know you think I'm supposed to be some sick pony, and we both know that I don't believe a word of it. And I'm not going to sit here and delay things, trying to convince you that I'm right, and that all of this isn't how it's supposed to be. But you and I both know that something just doesn't add up here. Twilight, I really don't, Applejack began, but Twilight continued, speaking quickly, but keeping her tone even. I know you don't want me bringing it up again, and I'm not going to ask you to do anything you don't want to. I just want you to promise me one thing. Just one thing. And I won't ask you to take off the dampener ever again, okay? Okay? She met Applejack's stare. Please, just think about what you know about me from your memories and how I should act based upon what my file says, and then ask yourself if my behavior fits. Am I acting like a schizophrenic and obsessive pony? If you will promise me that you'll honestly think about it, I'll never ask you about taking off my silencer again. Deal? Twilight could see the conflict swirling about between Applejack's eyes as she evaluated her choices. It was an innocuous request with a promise of never asking her to break regulations, but it also meant she was acknowledging, even for a moment, that a patient's delusions might have some merit. Twilight kept her face calm even as her insides twisted about. Please,— you're the element of honesty. You're one of my closest friends in all of Equestria. If any pony could tell that something isn't right, it's you.
Her heart plummeted as she saw the corners of Applejack's mouth tighten up, a surge of disappointment coursing through her veins.
She's going to say no. She's going to turn me down and keep thinking I'm a crazy pony. All right, Twilight, I'll think about it. If I can't even get Applejack to consider... Wait.
Twilight coughed, her eyes widening in surprise.
You what? You what? Applejack eyed her with a look of faint concern. I said I'd think about... She repeated, but the end of her sentence was lost in a gasp as Twilight pulled her into a desperately tight hug. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you! Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you! She cried out, nuzzling her friend's cheek and ignoring her cry of indignation. Relief bubbling up inside her, making her feel like she was floating on air. Okay, that's enough. Okay, that's enough, Twilight declared as she... Okay, that's enough. Okay, that's enough, Applejack declared as she pried Twilight's forelegs from around her neck with a gentle but firm pressure, the mare blushing faintly. Look, I ain't promising nothing but that I'll think about it, you understand? Twilight bobbed her head eagerly. Before she could say anything, Applejack continued. However, you're going to promise me something in return. Twilight's smile fractured. What? You're going to promise me that if I do this for you, you're not going to try and pull anything like you said back in Dr. Rose's office. You're not going to try to stop taking your medication or anything foolish like that. You're going to go to therapy, engage with the staff, and not be any kind of troublemaker, you hear? She stated, her voice filled with a maternal strength that made Twilight sympathize with Applebloom. She gave Twilight a level stare. If you're going to act like a grown mare and do that for me, then you have my word. Deal? Twilight stared at Applejack's proffered hoof. Just say yes, she told herself. It doesn't matter if you really are going to do it. Your goal is to get back home, and if you have to lie to do it, then so be it. It was a practical and realistic point, she had to concede. But when she looked into her friend's honest face, she couldn't help but hold herself back. She wasn't a liar. Could she betray her friend like that, even in so small a way, for the greater good? Was honesty a necessary sacrifice? Okay, Applejack, I promise, Twilight said, taking Applejack's hoof in her own and shaking it vigorously, hoping to hide her deception behind a mask of earnest agreement. There was a moment's hesitation in her friend's eyes, betraying something of her suspicion, but the mare said nothing. So, where's this caseworker I'm supposed to meet with? She asked, after releasing her grip, hoping to divert the conversation to a different topic. Just ahead, Applejack turned back and trotted off. Twilight hesitated for a heartbeat before following. She should be waiting for you. She had us more than one pony, of course, but we wanted to make sure that you got in right away to meet with her. The government has taken a particular interest in your situation, what with your treatment and all. It's still relatively new, and like with anything, they want to make sure your rights and needs are being taken care of. They're interested in my situation? Why? Well, it partly has to do with your, history, Applejack explained, deliberately not looking at Twilight. Oh, so it has to do with me being dangerous, too, she realized, frowning. And the other part? Well, it's the political side of things. Right now, there are plenty of ponies that want to ban some of the more invasive treatments, Applejack explained, sounding unsure of herself. No, not unsure. Conflicted. Dr. Rose's system offers a real chance at revolutionizing how we treat certain conditions, without having to resort to surgery, but it's still relatively new, so plenty of doctors aren't convinced yet. But I thought this wasn't untested. Isn't that what Dr. Rose said? Twilight stated, a hint of worry warming its way into her voice. Please don't tell me I'm some sort of guinea pig. Oh no, not at all, Sugarplum. The doctor gave Twilight her best reassuring grin. It's not untested, but it's still new. And there are plenty of doctors out there who aren't going to change their ways just because of some clinical tests. They're stuck in the mud, used to doing things the way they were taught. It was Applejack's turn to frown. I had plenty of professors like them back in school. There are too many who are afraid of anything that ain't just like they learned in their own university days. So, this isn't an untested treatment then, said Twilight with a small measure of relief. It's just new is all. But why does that make anyone interested in my case specifically? You'll have to ask someone else for the details there, hon. After all, you're not the only pony being treated, so I don't know why Rose has given you special treatment. Applejack finally glanced back over at Twilight, giving her a playful smirk. Maybe it's just because you're the cutest little filly in the hospital, she teased. Shoot, maybe you remind him of one of his granddaughters. Twilight rolled her eyes, but laughed despite herself. She was about to respond when Applejack came to a halt in one of the doors marked Visiting Consolation Room. She lifted her hoof to the handle, but stopped to give Twilight another measured glance. Now, I want you to be on your best behavior, you understand? She ain't gonna take off your silencer or any of that nonsense. Applejack's gaze was firm, emphasizing her point. A reminder of Twilight's earlier promise was there, but unspoken. But other than that, she is here to listen to any problems you might have. Feel free to talk to her about anything else, and don't be put off by her mannerisms. Her heart's in the right place, even if she does seem a bit haughty at times. She grinned at some personal joke. Now I'll introduce you to, since you probably won't remember her any, but I'll be back in half an hour to pick you up, alright? Wait, you know my caseworker? Twilight asked, confused at the sudden display of familiarity. Sure thing, Sugar Cube. We grew up in Ponyville together. Before Twilight could ask any more questions, she pushed open the door, guiding Twilight inside. A white unicorn with an elegant purple mane stood up from her seat, the table before her holding a few folders and stacks of papers. Twilight, why don't you say hello to Rarity? She's one of the nicest mares I know, so you'll be in good hooves. Hello, Twilight, darling, Rarity said with a broad grin. I know you might not remember me, but I just want you to know that I'm here to help you out at the very best of my abilities, and I sincerely hope you and I can become good friends again. Eventually, Twilight managed to close her mouth, nodding dumbly as the door closed behind her.